Right now, at this exact moment, as you finish reading this sentence, something is happening inside your relationship with technology that you do not yet have the language to describe, because the language that the mainstream technology conversation provides as the vocabulary for discussing operating systems, for discussing computing platforms, for discussing the daily digital environment whose operation your professional productivity, is the window during which the automated exploitation infrastructure that threat actors deploy against newly disclosed vulnerabilities operates against the millions of systems whose administrators have not yet applied the patch that closes the window. Something arrived inside the May 2026 update package that Canonical delivered to Ubuntu installations across the world through the automatic update infrastructure that millions of Ubuntu users have configured to run without their review. Because Canonical security communications have spent years establishing that applying updates promptly is the responsible security practice whose delayed adoption leaves systems exposed to the vulnerabilities that the update cycle's patches address, something that was not described in the update's release notes, with the specificity that would have allowed a user reading those notes to recognize that what was being installed represented a change to the privacy configuration of their system, rather than the security improvement NTS and package updates that the release notes language emphasized in the framing that Canonical's update communications use when the update being described contains CHA and NGS, whose characterization in terms of their privacy implications would generate the scrutiny and the res instance that deploying those changes through the automatic update mechanism, whose trust users have extended to security patches, allows the deployment to bypass by arriving in the same package, whose security improvements the user's security practice demands they apply without the delay that scrutiny and evaluation would require, and that the Ubuntu users whose choice of Linux as their computing platform was motivated specifically by the privacy properties that Linux's architecture provides relative to the Windows environment they migrated from, whose documentation of that migration and its privacy benefits this channel has been producing across the series, whose accumulation represents the technical record of the Linux privacy advantage that info-armed platform decisions require, are discovering only now as they examine their post-update system configurations and find that the privacy setting asset, whose careful configuration they had established as the foundation of the private computing environment, hint that their Linux adoption was intended to create, have been altered, reset, or overridden by the May update's changes in ways that their post-update system state makes visible to any user who examines that state with a specific knowledge of what to look for and where to look for it, rather than informing the users whose experiences the narrative is supposed to describe. Admitted directly. Admitted with specificity. Admitted in language whose plain meaning is not recoverable through the interpretive frameworks that communications professionals construct to make admissions sound like something other than what they are. Windows 11 is broken. Microsoft said it. The word broken was used. The problems were listed. The commitment to fix everything was made in terms whose public nature creates the accountability infrastructure that prior privacy commitments Microsoft has made about Windows 11 did not create, because they were issued without the specific, enumerated, publicly verifiable framework that this admission established around the promises that followed it. The admission happened. The promises were made. And every person who has been following this series for the documentation it has provided of exactly the things Microsoft just admitted are broken now has a specific and interesting analytical problem to work through, which is what to make of an admission and a promise from an organization whose relationship with truth about what its operating system does has been the subject of documented examination for long enough that the documented examination itself constitutes a reference library against which the admission and the promises can be evaluated with the specific credibility assessment that their historical record supports. Here is exactly what Microsoft admitted and how the specific language of the admission maps against the technical evidence this series has produced. Here is what Microsoft promised to fix, and what the promises specifically commit to versus what the language carefully avoids committing to. Here is why this admission happened now rather than earlier, and what the specific pressures that produced it reveal about the conditions that were required before Microsoft would acknowledge publicly what independent shares, privacy advocates, enterprise customers, and the series had been documenting for years. Here is what the track record of prior Microsoft privacy and performance commitments about Windows 11 tells us about the probability that the current promises will produce the architectural changes they implement, rather than the communications management responses that prior commitments produced. Here is what the regulatory environment that has been developing around Windows 11's practices means for the credibility of the admission and the enforceability of the promises in ways that prior commitments did not face. Here is what enterprise customers and individual users should actually do in response to an admission and a set of promises from an organization whose prior behavior toward its users, the admission itself acknowledges was not what users deserved. And here's the honest answer to the question that every Windows 11 user, Ho, has been living with the broken things Microsoft just admitted are broken is entitled to ask, which is whether Microsoft's admission and promises represent a genuine turning point or the latest in the series of communications events that have been managing rather than resolving the relationship between Windows 11's commercial architecture and the users whose machines it runs on. Had already done exactly what he was dreaming of doing, and had done it 30 years ahead of him. So he launched Vision 2030. A plan to transform Saudi Arabia into a global hub for business, tourism, entertainment, technology, and logistics. A blueprint not just for economic diversification, but for national reinvention. He allowed women to drive. He opened cinemas. He hosted Bruno Mars concerts. He announced said mega projects with names that sounded like science fiction. Neom, a futuristic city in the desert. The Red Sea Project, a luxury island resort. Diriyah, a cultural district built on the ruins of the ancient capital. Billions of dollars poured into construction. The world's media ran story after story about Saudi Arabia's transformation. And from Abu Dhabi and Dubai, the UAE watched this transformation very carefully. Because what Vision 2030 was describing was not just the creation of a diversified Saudi economy, it was the creation of a rival to Dubai. A rival with a larger population, a larger landmass, a larger government budget, and a crown prince willing to use the full machinery of the Saudi state to win. That is where the real rivalry began. Because Saudi Arabia was not trying to become something new. Saudi Arabia was trying to become something the UAE already was. The moment Riyadh declared that mission, the war was on, even if no one named it that. Saudi Arabia moved fast and it moved hard. In 2021, it began applying higher tariffs to goods made in UAE free trade zones, the exact zones that had made the UAE a manufacturing and re-export powerhouse. Then, in 2024, it went further. Riyadh announced that only companies with their regional headquarters physically inside Saudi Arabia would be Eli, Gibble for government contracts. Within months, multinational after multinational began packing up their Dubai offices and moving to Riyadh. By October 2025, 675 major global companies had registered regional headquarters in the Saudi capital, up from 540 just 12 months earlier. In logistics, Saudi Arabia announced plans to become a top 10 global logistics hub, targeting over 300 million air passengers per year and 4.5 million tons of air cargo. It doubled the capacity of Jeddah's South Container Terminal in 2025, pushing it to 4 million shipping containers per year, a direct challenge to Dubai's Jebel Ali port, which moved 14.5 million containers in 2023 and has been the undisputed logistics king of the region for decades. But it was not just ports and headquarters. The rivalry spread into energy markets as well. Inside OPEC+, the cartel that Saudi Arabia essentially runs and uses to manage global oil prices, the UAE began pushing back with increasing force. Saudi Arabia's preferred strategy has always been coordinated production cuts, keeping oil supply tight to keep prices high. But the UAE had spent billions expanding its own oil production capacity, and it did not want those investments sitting idle because Riyadh wanted to cut output. The UAE began pushing for higher personal production quotas, essentially asking to produce more even while the group cut overall supply. In 2021, this erupted into an open dispute that briefly threatened to break OPEC+ apart entirely. A resolution was found, but the underlying tension never disappeared. Abu Dhabi continued quietly building capacity. Riyadh continued quietly, resenting it. And a cartel that depends on trust between its members started operating with a fracture running through its foundation. For the UAE, this was not just competition. This was an existential threat. Everything Dubai had built, its position as the place where the world came to do business in the Middle East, was now being systematically dismantled by a bigger, richer neighbor with its own government contracts as leverage. The UAE was not going to surrender quietly. Abu Dhabi doubled down on AI investments, renewable energy, and global logistics. It continued attracting tech companies, sovereign wealth deals, and financial institutions. It leveraged its already deep international relationships. But it also found itself facing a new corporate tax for the first time, introduced in June 2023, at precisely the moment when Saudi Arabia was offering companies zero corporate tax as an incentive to relocate. Both countries also turned global sports and culture into a battlefield. Saudi Arabia launched the Future Investment Initiative, a massive annual conference in Riyadh designed to sign all to the world that the kingdom was now open for business. The UAE countered with the World Investment Forum and the World Government Summit. Saudi Arabia bought Premier League football clubs, launched its own live golf tour, and bid for the 2034 World Cup. The UAE deepened its Formula One presence and continued expanding its already legendary airline, Emirates. Both countries poured billions into soft power, museums, cultural events, international sporting franchises, each trying to project the image of modernity and openness that would attract the next generation of global investment, and each watching the others spending with barely concealed intensity. This economic battle was cold and invisible to most of the world. What happened next was neither cold nor invisible. To understand why two Gulf nations ended up fighting each other through proxies across 5 countries at the same time, you need to understand something about geography that most people never learn in school. The Arabian Peninsula is surrounded by some of the most important waterways on the planet. To its east, the Strait of Hormuz, through which roughly 20% of the world's oil supply passes. To its southwest, the Bab al-Mandab, the narrow throat of water connecting the Red Sea to the Gulf of Aden, through which massive amounts of global trade flow every single day on their way to and from the Suez Canal. These are not just important, they are irreplaceable. Whoever influences the lands on either side of these two choke points holds enormous power over the global economy. Both Saudi Arabia and the UAE understood this, and both built their foreign policies around it. But they built those policies in very different ways. Saudi Arabia thinks in terms of states. It wants stable governments, recognized borders, and predictable order around its neighborhood. It is a large country with long borders, long stretches of exposure, and instability on those borders terrifies Riyadh. A fractured Yemen on Saudi Arabia's southern border is an existential nightmare for the kingdom. A failed state in Ceuta and across the Red Sea is a security threat. Riyadh wants order, even if that order is messy. The UAE thinks in terms of ports. Abu Dhabi does not need to control governments the way Saudi Arabia does. What it needs is access. Access to coastlines, harbors, trade routes, and logistics networks. It has built its entire foreign policy around securing that access, often by working with whoever actually controls the ground, whether that is a recognized government or a militia or a separatist movement. If a warlord controls a port, Abu Dhabi will talk to that warlord. These two philosophies, order versus access, looked compatible as long as the two countries are not operating in the same places. But when the Arab world began fracturing after 2011 and wars broke out in Libya, Yemen, Syria, and Sudan, Riyadh and Abu Dhabi suddenly found themselves operating in every single one of those same places at the same time, with opposite strategies, backing opposite sides. Yemen was where the collision became impossible to hide. In 2015, Saudi Arabia put together a coalition of Arab nations to fight the Houthi rebels in Yemen, an Iranian-backed group that had seized the capital and was threatening to turn Saudi Arabia's southern neighbor into a permanent Iranian base on the kingdom's doorstep. The UAE joined that coalition enthusiastically. While they were genuinely unified. Saudi Arabia wanted to restore Yemen's recognized government and stabilize the country. The UAE wanted to secure Yemen's southern coast and ports. But slowly, across years of grinding war, those goals began pulling in opposite directions. The UAE built, funded, trained, and equipped a force called the Southern Transitional Council, the STC. On paper, the STC was part of the anti-Houthi coalition. In practice, it was a separatist movement that wanted to split Yemen in two, creating an independent state in the south. For the UAE, this was strategically perfect. A friendly government controlling the southern Yemeni coast, the ports, and the trade routes, all without the complications of managing a unified Yemeni state. For Saudi Arabia, it was a nightmare. A divided Yemen meant permanent instability on its southern border, a power vacuum that could breed terrorism, and a direct challenge to the principle of recognized sovereignty that Riyadh had staked its entire Yemen policy on. Saudi Arabia pressured the UAE to rein in the STC. The UAE kept funding and arming it anyway. Year after year, the STC grew stronger. It took control of Aden, Yemen's second city. It spread into the eastern provinces of Hadramaut and Mahra, areas sitting on Yemen's most significant oil and gas reserves with long coas lines on the Arabian Sea and access to key export ports. By December 2025, the STC had effectively consolidated control over all of South Yemen. Saudi Arabia saw this as crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. On December 26, 2025, Saudi warplanes struck the port of Mukalla. Then they struck again in Hadramaut, then in Mahra. The target: UAE-linked arms shipments, UAE-backed positions, and the STC forces that Abu Dhabi had spent years building. Within days, Saudi Arabia dissolved